My name is Olivia, and I will be talking today about deaf and hard of hearing culture. I chose this culture because it is a culture I know very little about, despite being an advocate for and ally of the disabled community. Culture is defined by Martin and Nakayama as learned patterns of behavior and attitudes shared by a group. However, throughout the textbook, disability culture is not heavily discussed. They discuss this culture only in reference to other readings the audience could seek out to learn more, and asking readers to consider whether deaf culture is actually a fully fledged culture. This discussion is alive among communication scholars, but it is clear from the perspective of deaf and hard of hearing people that they are part of a culture. The community argues that deaf people should not be thought of as disabled, but as members of a minority cultural group. However, there is an important distinction to keep in mind when seeking to understand deaf culture. As explained by Luey, Glass, and Elliott, by convention, deaf refers to an audiological condition or absence of hearing. Deaf means culturally deaf and implies membership in the community. This means that a person's medical diagnosis is separate from their cultural identity as deaf. As Luey, Glass, and Elliott further explain, people in the deaf community and culture tend to perceive deafness not as a disability, but as an alternate lifestyle and culture. Overall, people who are members of the deaf culture are diverse in terms of race, religion, traditions, and beliefs. And as a cultural group, they share a common language, social and organizational networks, and experiences of prejudice and discrimination, according to work by Mason. These three elements that unite them are not necessarily universal. For example, not every deaf person knows sign language, and even if they do, there are different forms of sign language in different areas. However, this is similar in a sense that other cultures are also not homogeneous, but they still share enough in common that these can be used as markers of the culture. An element I would like to highlight in discussing language is how the communication style of deaf people is unique. Martin and Nakayama define communication style as the meta-message that contextualizes how listeners are expected to accept and interpret verbal messages. Obviously, this definition is not inclusive to the communication style of deaf people, because the communication style of the culturally deaf is that it is highly dependent on visuals of some sort, as explained by Griffin and Frey. People who are deaf may rely on sign language, lip reading, or written language to understand messages. Thus, verbal messages or other auditory signals will not help them in communicating. Another element in the shared definition of deaf culture is the discrimination they face. In a study done by LaBelle, Booth Butterfield, and Rittenauer, however, it was found that attitudes were less negative for hearing individuals with more communication contact with profoundly hearing impaired deaf individuals. This finding is important in understanding how important cross-cultural communication is to helping end discrimination against the deaf community. As intercultural communication scholars, it is important to consider this element in how one learns about deaf culture. Although I do not have any deaf or hard of hearing friends, I have sought out to learn more about the community from members of the community. One source I have found very useful is a YouTuber named Jessica Kell-Green-Fozard. She is a British disabled rights activist, and a lot of her content is very informational on deaf culture. She has done videos on the differences between deaf and hard of hearing, why she uses hearing aids, and how to lip read. These have been very useful for me in getting a more personal view into deaf culture. Overall, in learning more about deaf culture, it has opened my eyes more to accessibility to different cultures and how people can do their part in accommodating and accepting others.